Beverly Rubik maintains that the 19th century concept of ether still has scientific merit. Continue watching to learn why.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to revisit the 19th century scientific concept of the ether. With me is biophysicist Dr. Beverly Rubik, who is the president and founder of the Institute for Frontier Science. She is also a professor of integrative medicine at Saybrook University, and she is the president of the U.S. Psychotronics Association. Welcome, Beverly.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Pleasure to be with you once again.
Yes.
The concept of the ether, of course, it was very important in 19th century physics, but actually I suppose you could say it goes back to Aristotle.
It goes back to Aristotle, and it also goes back to the ancient world. It's in the Vedas, if we consider the concept of the akasha.
To be equivalent to ether.
To be equivalent, yes. It's a way we would interpret that, which was the substrate, really, of giving rise to all of creation, together with a life force, the prana.
Yeah. The idea of the akasha, of course, as I understand it, is that it contains the memory of everything that's ever happened anywhere.
Yes, the akashic records.
Yeah. But Aristotle referred to the ether as the quintessential element.
Yes, Aristotle saw air, fire, earth, and water as changeable elements, but in his cosmology, the ether was also essential. It was kind of that which held the substrate of all those changeable elements and which itself was unchanging.
So one might think of that as equivalent to space.
Yes, today we would say the vacuum or so-called empty space. Of course, these conjure up absolutely nothing inside, but as it turns out, there is no really empty space, even in every view of science.
Well, I gather that in the 19th century, as radio waves were being discovered, the electromagnetic spectrum was being explored. The idea was that electromagnetic waves need to propagate through something, the way waves on the ocean propagate through water.
Exactly.
So the ether was postulated as the substance through which electromagnetic waves propagate.
Yes, and it makes sense. I mean, what is waving if you have nothing there? For example, sound doesn't travel through empty space without matter. And does electromagnetism need a substrate? Well, Faraday thought so. His whole theory of electromagnetism was based on the notion of an ether. We forget about that in modern science. We still use the laws of Maxwell, and that's our latest understanding of light and electromagnetism, but somehow we threw out the ether. But he embraced it. It was absolutely essential.
And as I understand it, basically it was Einstein's theory of special relativity that didn't require the ether, and then they did the Michelson-Morley experiments that people regard today as having disproven the concept of the ether or the necessity for ether. You disagree?
Well, that's the history in the books. Certainly, I don't disagree with that, but they actually found an ether drift. What does this mean? They were looking at light traveling in this direction and then perpendicular to it. And they said, well, Earth is rotating in a certain way. So if we have it moving in the direction of the rotation of Earth or against that rotation, we should see ether drag. We should see a slight change in the speed of light due to the rotation of the Earth.
Like when an airplane is circling the Earth, it either has a headwind or a tailwind.
Exactly. The drag of this rotation. Yeah. But they didn't find the predicted value of 30 kilometers per second. They found a lesser one. It was 8 to 10, 25 to 30% of the expected value.
So it wasn't zero.
No, it wasn't zero, but somehow it's still interpreted as a null result. Mm-hmm. And later, some decades later, Miller also did these experiments extensively and also found the same values, about 10 kilometers a second ether drag, or so-called ether drag, due to the rotation of the Earth. So it's amazing that based on that experiment alone, we all think that there's no ether. Einstein's theory of relativity did not need an ether, but Einstein made a speech in Holland, as I recall, in the early 1920s, and he said it was really impossible to throw out the ether because empty space had many properties related to electromagnetics, and so we really needed an ether. That's what he said in German.
He said if there were no ether, there would be no properties at all to empty space.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we forget that. Even Einstein gave precedence for the ether, but his own theories did not require it.
Well, as a student of esoteric culture, I'm very much aware of the fact that the Theosophists and many other esoteric organizations talk about etheric energy. And these days, if you asked me about it, I would say, well, you find many discarded scientific concepts that were picked up by mystics, like the astral plane. Was such a concept at a time when they thought in medieval times that there were these heavenly spheres associated with each of the planets.
Right.
And so the astral plane was like ascending to the realm of the planets. But now, maybe there's a need to reevaluate the concept of the ether, just as we reevaluate the concept of the akasha. People are saying we've got to take a second look at that because people are talking about universal consciousness, 0-point energy, and any number of other energies like orgone energy that permeate space.
Exactly. There are so many of these, even in conventional science, the concept of dark energy and dark matter from cosmology that make the equations work. I understand they're finally having some evidence of this down at CERN, but these are great percentages of the universe. Something on the order of 90% of the universe is this dark energy or dark matter. And then we have the concept of 0-point energy, which is essential for quantum theory, that there's like a sea of vibration, a fundamental substrate out of which there are fluctuations that become particles or waves in quantum theory that we measure in experiments. But the absolute sea of energy, which is enormous, it's on the order of 10 to the 90th grams per cubic centimeter mass equivalent. It's practically an infinite amount of energy in a cubic inch.
And I gather, now that I think about it, right about the same time that the concept of the ether was discarded, many new concepts were developed to replace it, like wave-particle duality, that matter isn't either a pure wave or a pure particle. They seem incompatible, and yet somehow matter is both.
Matter is both. manifesting in some experiments. It depends on your observation tool.
Yeah.
If you put up something to see waves, you're going to see waves. If you put up an instrument to see particles, you count particles.
Which suggests the role of consciousness.
Exactly.
In all of this. And when you bring up the idea of the akasha as the ancient Vedic equivalent of the ether, once again, we're invoking consciousness.
And I think that should be part of the unified field.
Mm-hmm.
When we get there, it must contain consciousness. Of course, that's not where conventional science is grasping, I think. They're still looking to unify electromagnetism, strong force, weak force, and gravity.
Yeah.
And yet they've not considered consciousness. It's really not part of science. It's amazing how it has not yet permeated academia.
Well, consciousness is not part of physics. It's part of psychology as a science, I suppose. But in any case, it's ironic that you can't do physics without consciousness.
Yes.
And yet somehow consciousness has no role in physics, except, of course, for people like Max Planck and the other founders of the field of quantum physics who suggested, as I think you're suggesting, that consciousness is fundamental.
It is fundamental. And in one view of interpretation of quantum theory, a conscious observer is collapsing the wave function. Mm-hmm. But in other views, it's not essential. Right. So it depends on your interpretation.
A lot of physicists want to do away with the necessity for a conscious observer.
Amazingly so. It's like, it reminds me of philosopher Dennett, who denies consciousness, yet wrote a book called Explaining Consciousness. Yeah. And then he says there really is no consciousness. Right. He's out of his own mind, in my opinion.
Daniel Dennett. Right. And many people say his book should be titled Consciousness Explained Away.
Yes, that's a much better title.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would say with the quantum, we have the resurgence of an ether, even though it's never called that. Once a term has been discarded from science, whether it's ether or vital force, we don't see it re-entering. I would say historically the ether became many things in the late 19th century, a kind of soft, malleable concept to fit the chemists, the physicists, etc. And so it was too wishy-washy in the end, and that's probably the real reason it disappeared. Tesla was working on trying to bring the world free energy, and I think he was probably working at the level of the ether. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's fortunate that we didn't get that 100 years ago, given the status of, let's say, ethics and morality of humanity, because if we made a weapon based on the ether and the amount of energy in a cubic inch, it might have undermined everything. So
now you're talking about 0 point energy. 0
point, the most fundamental energy that is enormous and much bigger than atomic energy and nuclear energy. Mm-hmm. So, but someday maybe we will harness that etheric energy. And I think it's something that happens with intent, in small ways, in Psi, in parapsychology.
Well, it's interesting that Hal Puthoff, the physicist who pioneered the research in what we now call remote viewing, is also the very same physicist who's regarded as one of the pioneers in the very notion of 0 point energy.
Yes, he is, exactly. Mm-hmm. Yes. So through intention, we can manifest something that wasn't there before, and it seems miraculous, but it might be collapsing a little bit of that randomness at the level of the 0 point energy, making it coherent, cohering it.
Well, and I've done many interviews with a scientist, philosopher, Bernardo Kastrup, who is an idealist philosopher, and basically idealism and philosophy is pretty much what Max Planck said. Consciousness is fundamental. Everything emerges from consciousness. Matter is an epiphenomenon of consciousness. He argues for that and often refers to what some people would call universal consciousness, meaning not my individual consciousness, your individual consciousness. Those are considered like little wrinkles in universal consciousness. That might be another way of thinking of what was once called the ether.
I think so. I would say the substrate, which we might call the ether, is not only the substrate for matter and energy, but also consciousness. So we can consider that as a C. And of course, the sea has a vibration and sometimes manifests tiny fluctuations, little waves, and sometimes large, enduring waves, even tsunamis that might be considered more hard and fast, like matter. But, nobody's ever seen an atom. It's interesting. We have the idea that matter is hard and fast, but matter has a lot of empty space. And with it, I think, is part of this sea of consciousness. Right in there.
Well, now when I have to come back, because you said nobody has ever seen an atom. I thought I saw a photograph where they used atoms, maybe it was molecules, to spell out the letters IBM on one occasion.
Well, it's always a representation of an atom through some process, but the concept of an atom per se is just a theoretical construct.
Well, that's very interesting. We take atoms to be real. And not only atoms, but all the particles, electrons, protons, quarks.
Yes.
Even the up quark, the down quark, the charmed quark. These are all very real, but are quite invisible to us.
Well, it's called the particle zoo, I think, to the physicists. And it seems like if they throw something with greater force in those accelerator experiments, they get more pieces, just like throwing a vase against the wall. You get bigger, you get more fragments.
Yeah.
And that's what it seems to me, that particle physics is nothing more than smashing matter into tinier and tinier pieces. I don't know if there's a bottom line.
Well, I gather that the bottom line for some would be what they call the quantum plenum.
Yes. That would be.
Or another way to think of it would be the Schrödinger probability waves, that it's like a probability cloud that some people would suggest is the fundamental basis of reality.
Well, Einstein didn't like that. He said God doesn't play dice with the universe.
Yeah.
So, nor did David Bohm, who studied with Einstein.
Right.
But rather, he just couldn't accept it, and he tried to get a more classical view of reality, even to squeeze that out of quantum theory. So, lots of people are unhappy with the quantum realm because of this probability nature of the substrate of reality. It does feel uncomfortable and counterintuitive.
Einstein said famously that the quantum theory implied spooky action at a distance, but now that's been confirmed by multiple experiments. You and I were involved in our student days at Berkeley with many of the people who were working on that problem. And so now quantum entanglement is considered well accepted in physics. And even though it's quite mysterious, that it suggests, as I understand it, every particle in the universe is somehow instantaneously connected with each other.
Yes. As we are in some way as well.
And that instantaneous connection across the entire universe, would you say that's somehow a new way of speaking about what was once thought of as the ether?
I think so, yes. Again, the ether is a substrate connecting everything geometrically or in some fundamental way, tying everything together. It's another way of seeing it. There's just so many ways the ether-like things come back to us in modern physics. Dark energy, dark matter, quantum plenum, zero-point energy, this quantum sea of fluctuating energies. We can't dismiss these things.
Well, certainly as a parapsychologist, I would have to say there are hundreds and hundreds of experiments now that show that the human mind is capable of interacting both at an informational level and at a kinetic level with targets, let us say, that are in distant locations in space and time. That suggests, properties of the universe, properties of consciousness, space, and time that are not understood by contemporary physics.
Exactly. And I think Bill Tiller's experiments showed that if you repeat experiments that engage in tension, to make nourishing change like that in matter or a biological system, and you do that over and over again in the same location, in the same laboratory, it happens more readily. It's as if you are changing space fundamentally with conscious intention.
Yeah. And we see that as well in parapsychology and psychometry experiments, where a talented psychometrist or psychic can hold an object, perhaps some archaeological finding, and or even look at it, not necessarily hold it, but focus on that object, and can pick up, one might say, the memories that are attached to the object itself and describe how it was once used, what it was for.
Something that happened to me in relation to that, someone handed me a rock and said, "Tell me what you feel."
Yeah.
And the rock became so hot I had to drop it. I said, "It's like, I'm on fire. What is this rock?" He said, "This rock was in the first nuclear detonation."
Whoa.
In the desert.
Mm-hmm.
So, interestingly, I could pick that up. But I think even inner so-called unconscious matter can retain the memory of its history. And I don't even know if it's unconscious. Maybe that's not fair. Consciousness may permeate everything, actually. And we just download our little piece somehow as an individual pore of divinity that we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, it raises many philosophical questions when we talk about consciousness that way. And of course, there have been many discussions on this channel approaching that question from different angles. But what you're suggesting here is that the concept of the ether, as it's been used both in 19th century physics and in ancient philosophy, isn't dead at all.
No, the ether is alive and well. It just has many new names in science. But what's interesting is that they don't talk to one another. You know, the dark matter, dark energy people, I don't think are thinking about quantum plenum, and nobody's thinking much about consciousness and how that fits in.
And the akasha.
So there's a compartmentalization which continues in science instead of somebody really trying to pull this all together. Some of us, like you and I, are, but I would say academic science is gaining more compartmentalization and not pulling it together.
Well, in fact, I suppose it's fair to say that one of the real problems in academia as a whole, universally, is over-specialization. People become they know more and more and more about narrower and narrower and narrower fields of study, that there are very few generalists, and people who do interdisciplinary work are largely frowned upon.
It's almost impossible to get a position in academia if you were a generalist or multidisciplinary. You need to be in your little slot over here and stick to the boundaries of that. I remember when I was at Temple University and had conferences on mind and matter, for example, and invited the philosophy department. Suddenly they were miffed that I, a biophysicist, was in their turf talking about mind and matter. That was philosophy, they said, not science, and I shouldn't tread over there. And as a result, they weren't interested in coming to the conference.
I see.
So, I mean, there's turfdom in academia, very clearly delineated by the field. And it's a very unfortunate thing because nobody's building a grand, unified view of reality.
Well, there are a few people who do that outside of academia. Yes. Of course, my mentor, Arthur Young, was one such person. You knew him, as I recall.
Yes, of course. So it's just not happening in a big way in academia. There's always a few scholars who, and Arthur was an armchair philosopher, a brilliant man. And we all learned a lot from him in those days. Fond memories.
Yes, indeed. Well, Beverly Rubik, it's once again a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for coming to Albuquerque and being with me.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.